So as we talk about conditioning the horse, we're going to discuss some of the physical and behavioral aspects of training and conditioning. We're going to stress the importance of training your horse so that it's sport specific to the exercise that you want to do with that horse. And we're going to talk about how you can monitor your horse's progress throughout the conditioning program. So one thing that we might want to take into consideration is the rider or the handler. So everything that you want to do with the horse, you want to do it under safe conditions. So that includes wearing a helmet, usually you want to have somebody else around if you're riding. Our sport is actually a pretty dangerous sport. And it's important to have somebody there from a safety standpoint. You want to make sure that your current or at least potential skill level matches your training goals for the year. Sometimes I think we want to do, the Grand Prix level, but we've got the training level skills at the time. So make sure that you're matching correctly your goals with what actually can be accomplished for that riding season. It's really helpful if you go in with a good understanding of some principles of conditioning. So we'll get you started on that today. But it certainly doesn't hurt to continue on with your education and learn more about keeping that horse healthy through the conditioning process. You want to be able to problem solve when problems occur within that training or conditioning process. And if you can't solve those problems on your own, make sure that you've got a team of experts that you can consult with, either your veterinarian or your trainer or your instructor or your coach. And then you also want to be able to recognize potential health concerns quickly before they really blow up on you. So at the first signs that a horse is getting a little sore, a little lame, you should be able to recognize that. If you don't have that skill level yet and you're training a horse at a pretty intense level, then you really should be doing that with some professional guidance to make sure that your horse stays healthy through the process. So now we're going to turn, and for the rest of the presentation, we're going to pretty much focus on our horses, ponies, mules, donkeys, whatever you're working with right now. But look at your equine athlete and take into consideration their age. We're going to start conditioning and training with a 2-year-old a lot differently than we would if we're looking at a 7-year-old, which still would be different than if we were bringing back a senior athlete, 20 years plus, back into conditioning. So the age of your horse is extremely important. And also, what is their background training? What do they come to the table with? What skill set do they have? Maybe you're just polishing up some of the skills, or maybe you're having to teach something new to this horse so that you can progress this year to a higher level of competition. And as we talk about performance goals, we want to also make sure that our horse's athletic potential matches the goals that we have set for them. That's going to make the conditioning and training process a lot easier and a lot safer for both the horse and the rider. So it's important then that we match the horse's conformation, physical capabilities, as well as their mental capacity to do the work that we're asking. We wouldn't necessarily want to take a horse, even though they were really fast, if they were real fractious mentally, that potentially may not make the best timed event horse, because those horses, to be successful over a long career, have to have a really good mind. So some considerations to take hold of. So first, we'll talk a little bit more about the physical response to exercise. And so throughout this process, when we're conditioning the horse, we're looking at increasing their strength and speed, maybe increasing the endurance, so how long can they exercise. We're looking at enhancing skill sets of the horse, so that might be maneuvers. If you have a reining horse, you're looking at your stops, your spins, your rollbacks, your circle work, your lead changes. We're also looking at minimizing any soreness and consequently minimizing any injuries. So recognizing the hint of soreness, I can't emphasize how important that is. Recognizing a hint of soreness or fatigue in the horse is extremely important to decrease their chance of an injury that's going to put them off of training. So one way we look at the horse's physical response is monitoring their vital statistics during exercise. So we all know that the heart rate steadily increases as we increase the intensity that we're riding the horse. So at rest, a horse will have a resting heart rate of around 40 beats per minute, and that's going to double when we ask that horse to walk. A trot's going to be a little stronger heart rate at 130 beats per minute. Canter is getting on up there into that 150, 160 range. And then gallop is pushing you more up into your anaerobic capacity. When we're looking at respiration rate in the horse, then horse at rest is going to take between 8 to 16 breaths per minute. And as we walk them, that's going to increase, as well as when we trot. And then once we get into the canter and the gallop, the horse is actually going to breathe with their stride. So with every stride that they're taking, they're going to time their respiratory rate with their stride rate. So we can monitor our horse's vital signs through both visual means. So if we're looking at respiration rate, we would monitor either the flare of their nostrils or the expansion of their abdominal area or flank area. If they're in really heavy breathing, like right after exercise, you'll see a lot of movement within the barrel area of the horse. We can also palpate for heart rate or pulse. So one of the easiest ways, for me anyway, to take a horse's pulse is right under their jawline, the mandibular artery. And it takes a little bit of practice to find it. But once you find it and you feel it and you roll it around, if you don't press too hard, you've got to press hard enough to feel the pulse. But if you press too hard, you won't feel the pulse either. So it takes a little bit of practice to be able to take their pulse through the mandibular artery. You can also go down the horse's leg and take a digital pulse, and there's a lot of resources online to where they'll show you with video how to take these pulses. So I would definitely practice that and know your horse's resting heart rate as well, and their resting respiration rate, and take note of how they respond to exercise with both. You can also use a stethoscope, and you can pick up a stethoscope at some of the bigger feed stores for, maybe $20. So that's a good way to also listen to the horse's heart rate. Using a heart rate monitor, that's another option. Probably not necessary if you're working your horses primarily at that aerobic threshold that we'll talk about here in a little bit. But if you're doing some really serious, intense work, your race horses, your eventing horses, potentially your endurance horses, then using a heart rate monitor and investing in a heart rate monitor may really help you fine-tune your conditioning program. The most important thing is know your horse's norms, know how they usually respond to exercise. An extremely elevated pulse or respiration rate could indicate some signs of stress and fatigue in the horse that you need to be wary of. So we'll talk about aerobic conditioning, and most of us, this is the type of conditioning that we're really stressing with our horses. So we're trying to build up a little bit of endurance in these horses. We're working primarily at the slower speeds, and the horses are working at more of a moderate heart rate. So this would fit into a lot of the rail work that we do with horses in performance arenas, the Western pleasure horses, hunter under saddle, even some of our more showy classes, your country pleasure classes, would probably go along this rate. If we're looking at lesson horses, they're usually working at a more aerobic type of conditioning. And when we think about an aerobic workload, then we're looking at heart rates that are going to get upwards into the 140, maybe approaching 150 range, but not much higher than that. So we're typically working horses more at a walk, trot, and canter. We're alternating some easy work along with moderate to hard days of work. As we think about a horse's aerobic capacity to do work, we also want to think about how much weight are they requiring. So if we have a trainer who, let's say, is a really lightweight trainer riding our horse, and maybe they're 150 pounds, and then we hop on our horse for the show ring, and maybe we weigh 20, 30 pounds more than that trainer. Have we really conditioned that horse enough so that they can carry additional weight? And even some show saddles, as opposed to training saddles, can, if you're looking at your Western divisions, can really add to a horse's workload. So some ways that we can increase the intensity of an aerobic workload is by asking the horse to collect up more, doing some hill work, doing some pole or gymnastics work if we're jumping, and then doing some of our foundation or basics for some drill work for forehand pivots, hindquarter turns. An anaerobic workload then is usually performed at a much shorter distance, but at an extremely higher intensity. So these would be your race horses, cutting horses, roping horses in their events, polo horses would be considered anaerobic workload. If you're taking a horse over a intermediate cross-country course, that would be an anaerobic workload. So anytime that heart rate is getting upwards 150 or greater, you're putting your horse into an anaerobic workload. So when we're thinking anaerobic workload, we're not necessarily thinking all day long distance. We're thinking short-term, high-intensity type work. And again, we're looking at the speed. The faster you go, the more intense your workload is, the more weight your horses are carrying, the more intense that workload is going to be. Any type of incline is going to increase the intensity of the work. You'll see a lot of people getting their horses in racing condition that will actually use incline, slight hills to help with that training. And then the amount of effort that the horse is putting into jumping the big fences, or again with the cutting or your barrel or timed event horses, would also go into an anaerobic type workload. So we talked a little bit about the cardio, the respiratory type of work that we're asking horses to do, but we're also looking at the flexibility or the coordination of the horse, building that aspect of the horse up, depending on what we're going to be using them for. And this is where it's really important to think about what your end goal is. So when we're talking about building on flexibility and coordination, we're starting with building blocks. So your circle work, your lateral work, backing up, maybe a little bit of gymnastics. And, you know, when you go to some of the race training barns, they're out there, you know, riding some of their 2-year-olds the same way that you would your 2-year-old that's geared towards the hunter ring or the Western pleasure ring. It's all starting on the basics of the building blocks. So this would be kind of that basic level conditioning. And then you're going to start adding in more specifics into your program to build your horse's neuromuscular type capacity. So taking those building blocks and moving them into more specific maneuvers like your spins, rollbacks, your stops, jumping, extended trot, flying changes, the half pass if you're working in dressage. So we've talked about the physical component of exercise. There's also the psychological aspect of exercise. So as we're working within this context of conditioning our horses, the whole time we want to think about what are our goals psychologically for our horse. And we all love those fresh looking horses with their ears forward that have that look of, hey, I'm happy to be here. They're not trying to leave the gate. They're happy to go forward. That's the type of horse that we all want. So we need to train to get to that. So we want a horse that has increased confidence. Our training program should decrease any kind of resentment that you might see. So if your horse is constantly twitching their tail, kicking out, pinning their ears, that's showing some sign of resentment. You have to figure out what the problem is there. We want to decrease the boredom. We want to keep our horses fresh and happy. So if we're going into the arena and we're riding for 45 minutes, you know, the first 10 minutes at the walk and trot, and then we're going to do some circle work, and it's same thing after same thing, same place, same time, same channel, eventually that horse is going to get pretty bored of that routine. So we want to change some things up. So some guidelines to keeping the horse kind of fresh and trying for you are to use very fair and respectful training practices. And usually you can recognize pretty quick if something's not fair when you're working with a horse. And if you can't recognize that, work with somebody that can tell you. So if you come out of the pen and you're jerking because your horse isn't necessarily framed up the way you want him to be, that's probably not very fair. It's after the fact, and it's not a very effective way of training the horse to give to the bridle. You're just creating that resentment that we talked about, and you're decreasing the horse's confidence and respect in how you're going to work with them from then on forward. You want to be able to recognize and reward a horse for trying to get it right. They may not get there. They may not be where you want them to be. But if they're trying to get there, then you need to recognize that and reward them for it. That's where all the really good horse trainers are at. They're recognizing and rewarding a horse for trying to get someplace that they want them to go. And if you don't do that, some horses will still respond to you, but they're not going to look really fresh. Other horses are just going to flat out get mad and quit on you. So that's a really essential part of the training process. You don't want to override the horse. And by override, I mean, if you've got a reining horse that's a 70 kind of horse, don't go out there every day and try to ride a 76 pattern. It's not fair to the horse. So you don't want to override. You want to give your horse frequent breaks. Breaks are their reward. Horses look forward to just standing still for a while. Just because you're on the horse's back doesn't have to mean that you're moving constantly. So give frequent breaks, especially after they've done something pretty intense. You want to let those horses air up. You also want to change things up. Again, if you're riding the Western pleasure horse, that doesn't necessarily mean that you're just walk, trot, and loping around the arena on the rail. You want to change it up, do something a little different. You know, long trot those horses, pick up the pace a bit, do some pattern work in the middle, take them outside, but keep things fresh. And then it's okay to regroup when necessary. I've been out riding and things just aren't going the way that I thought they would. I think they should. And rather than just keep, trying to muddle my way through, sometimes it makes more sense. Go back to the basics, something really easy that both you and your horse can accomplish that day, and then put the horse up and think about it. Get some advice, watch some videos, figure out, a better plan to get where you want to go. So, the concept of, I said that I was going to get the horse to do this today and we're not leaving this arena until we get that done. Sometimes that's not very realistic or very helpful, and you can end up really destroying some good foundation that you've worked on. So specifically then, when we're working on a conditioning program, some important features that a conditioning program should have: it should be very organized, it should be specific to the sport that you're preparing the horse for. It should be progressive. So again, you're not staying at the same level, but you're moving forward and increasing your skill level. And it should also be interesting. So it has to be interesting for the horse. So as we look at a training schedule then, we're going to spend it, let's just say we're bringing a horse out from the winter. Typically here in Michigan, I'm not riding horses in the midst of winter. Maybe the ground's too icy and I don't have an indoor, so the horse is just turned out. So I'm taking this horse in. And that initial 6 to 8 weeks is going to be background training. Even if that horse knows everything, I've still got to condition him physically and get him mentally back in the mindset of working again. So I need to plan out how long is that going to take for me to get the background training in for this horse. And usually if that horse is coming in without any kind of conditioning, then you probably are going to want to spend a good 6 weeks getting the background training in. So you need to go from your goal and move that timeline backwards, see where you're at. So you've got about 6 weeks of background training. And now once the horse is physically and mentally ready to progress in their skills and progress to your goal, now you can start introducing more sport-specific maneuvers. You're going to increase that intensity of your program if you're doing speed work. And it should be a steady, progressive type ramp up until you're, if you're working towards a big competition, then that's going to be your final goal. So you may have some smaller competitions, some in-state type competitions before you get to your main goal for the year. That helps you work your way up to that. So that's the training schedule that you want to follow. So going back to the background training, then we'll just take components of that little graph. Your background training is usually going to incorporate maybe more groundwork into your initial sessions. I have a horse right now who's extremely cold-backed, and I know there's a lot of there's a lot of pros and cons to lunging a horse, but I'm going to lunge that horse before I ride him because I know he's going to buck like a banshee whenever I girth them up. So I have to incorporate some groundwork. But initially then, before I ever get on that horse, I may do groundwork for a full week before I start getting on that horse's back again. Because I really want him to be comfortable with the saddle, and it just takes him a little bit longer to get there after he hasn't been ridden for a while. You want it to gradually increase the number of work bouts each week that you're riding. So maybe you start out week 1 doing some really light riding 2 to 3 times a week. Week 2, now you're up to 4. And then you keep adding a day in there. So usually horses in peak training, you're riding them around 4 to 6 times a day, depending on your ultimate goal and the horse's training level and how they respond to work. You always want to make sure, though, your horse has at least 1 day of rest. And a lot of times active rest is the best kind of rest. And by active rest, I mean that they're either turned out for the day where they can move around at will, or maybe you just, toss on a saddle and bridle and just walk them out through the field. But a rest period should not necessarily be confined in a stall because sometimes we'll get into some issues with tying up and whatnot.
Hey, Chris, we do
Yeah,
have a question here in the Q&A I think makes sense to ask right now. The
sure.
question is, in triathlon training, we tend to have a few weeks of progressive training and then scale back a week to let the body adapt and recover a little. Are there any benefits of this for the horse?
Probably, maybe in some of your senior athletes, you just have to be careful about you don't want to end up with horses tying up because they've been off work for a while and then you start them out strong again. So it kind of depends on the intensity of the workload. So I would say with a Western pleasure horse or something where you're looking at more of a aerobic type capacity, and you may not be pushing them too hard anyway. If you were to take a week off for the horse, then that would be okay. But if you've really got a horse fitted up, then to take a week off and go right back into hard training, you might see some problems there. So I don't think it's necessarily the same concept that you would use as a human athlete in kind of tip-top shape. You want to keep maybe a little bit steadier pace. Now, that being said, if you start to see some signs of fatigue in your equine athlete, so maybe they're starting to go off feed a little bit, or you're seeing a real dip in performance, or maybe you're seeing some mental aspects that you're not liking and how they're responding to training, then you may want to go to 3 to 4 days of an active rest period to see if you can bring those horses back, because they may start, that might be a sign that they're on the brink of hurting themselves. But as far as just taking off a week to give your horse some rest until you start back in more intense work is probably not as good of an idea in the equine as it might be for human athletes. I hope that answered the question there. So we're going to talk a little bit more about exercise load. So as we're doing this background type training, it's going to take you about 6 weeks to really build the cardiovascular system back up in a horse if it's starting off at ground zero. So we're considering a horse that's basically has lost any of the conditioning from the previous season. So hasn't worked for 3 months or so, and we're building them back up from ground zero. So about 6 weeks to build their cardio output. Now that being said, if you're working with senior athletes, I would allow 8 to 10 weeks to really build them up. And not necessarily cardio. Horses are pretty good about building up cardio, but from a muscular standpoint, your older horses are going to lose muscle mass a lot quicker than our younger horses. So you want to take that into consideration as you build them back up. So we can get this cardio buildup done if we're working our horses 3 to 4 times a week. But you want to begin slow. So I use an app when I'm running, and I'm a terrible runner, but I do it because it frees up my mind a little bit. But I use an app called Couch. What is it? Couch. It's like a couch potato app. I don't know. From couch to somebody type that in for me because my brain's not recalling it right now. But anyway, it's a cool app because it takes you through an 8-week period or so, and it builds you up really slowly. So you want to use that same aspect in that background training with your horse. So you may want to begin in 20-minute sessions. Some of that may be groundwork, a little bit of it riding, and then you continually add 5 minutes per week as you build those sessions up to 45 minutes to an hour. You want to include within that workout week at least one kind of longer but lower intensity workout just to start building up a little bit more endurance in your horse as well. And that's a good reason to go out on a trail ride. So here would be kind of a typical schedule for starting out some background training. And this is over an 8-week period. And you can see week 1, you may just spend time walking, lots of circle work, working on flexibility. Then start adding some trot work in on week 2, building that up. And then on week 4, now you're introducing some canter work and continuing on through week 8. It doesn't take a whole lot of canter work if all we're working on is anaerobic type capacity here for horses. And one thing I've noticed, at least with my horses, if I have issues with canter work, I don't necessarily solve those issues by cantering my horse around a lot. I solve those issues by going back to some of my basics at the walk and trot and working on my flexibility and collection, getting that horse really soft in the bridle. And then it makes my canter work a lot easier. So that's my 2 cents worth on that. Again, lunging a horse can comes into play. For some of us older riders, I know when I was younger, I was riding 2-year-olds, and lunging was for sissies, and if you couldn't sit and ride a horse through a little bit of nerves or whatever, then you shouldn't be riding them at all. Now that I'm a little bit older, and I've had a lot of friends that are much better equestrians than I am, take some pretty bad spills and get laid up for quite a while. And invariably what they would say is, I just got lazy and I didn't lunge my horse that day. I knew it was fresh, but I just hopped on anyway. So I think you can look at lunging as both from the horse's standpoint of working with them, but also of a rider safety standpoint. So think about that. Give yourself permission to lunge your horse if you need to lunge them before you get on them. But the other thing that I really like about lunging horses, as I've got one gelding now who's in his 20s, and I can recognize when I'm lunging him what my ride is going to be like before I get on. So I know what to look for in his gait to see if he's a little stiff that day, if he's catching a little bit in his hock. That might be a day that tells me, you know what, lay off the loping around. Don't do anything too strenuous like rollbacks on this horse. Just do a lot of long trotting with him for that day. But then if I have him on the lunge line and he seems really collected, he's doing his transition work really nice, and he looks really strong behind, that's a day I can maybe go a little further with my ride with him. So I think especially for older horses, we can lunge them and look for signs that tells us how they're doing that day. Because it's kind of like me now as I get up. Boy, some days I'm running and I feel great, and some days I'm running and it just hurts. It just, every stride is bad. I can understand that. My horse isn't going to understand it if I push him through that kind of stress. So take lunging for what it's worth. One thing about lunging though, that I would stress is, when you lunge, do it with intention. So make it progressive, and think about how you ride a horse. When you ride a horse in the arena, you don't walk, trot, and canter all the same direction and then turn the horse around, walk, trot, canter. No. You walk a horse to the left, turn them around, walk them to the right, turn them around, trot them to the left, right? So we're constantly changing sides before we ever get to our canter work. I would follow the same approach when you're lunging a horse. Even though it's a little bit more work for you as the handler, alternate sides with each gait. So walk your horse to the right, walk your horse to the left, trot your horse to the right, trot your horse to the left, and then you can canter them to the right, canter them to the left. Because when you're riding, you're not going to get good work to your right if your left side is stiff, and vice versa. It's the same thing then when we're working with them on the ground. I think also consider lunging horses in full tack. Make it a little more fun with ground pulls. Add some transition work in there and really drive your horse forward. Focus on those hind legs, don't let your horse lollygag around on the lunge line. Make it intentional. Keep your circle size as large as you can and still have control. So when we're looking at a more sports-specific workout, once you get into remembering that graph, the more progressive steps to your goal, now we're getting into more sports-specific progressive type workouts. You want to make sure, though, that you have a balanced workout. So you want to spend time at the beginning warming your horse up, and at the end cooling your horse down. Don't Don't shortchange your ride on those two, the beginning and the end, because those sometimes are the most important. During your warm-up, when you're riding, is also giving you a feel for where that horse is at on that particular day, and sometimes where you as a rider are at on that particular day. And you're going to spend another 20 minutes or 20% of your ride working on flexibility exercises. So your small circle work, your lateral work, some strength building exercises. Endurance just comes hand in hand with how long you're riding, but the time that you spend on actual maneuvers or your training objective should be relatively smaller compared to the whole time that you're working your horse out. In other words, you don't go out and say, well, today I'm going to work on my horse's spins and then spin your horse for an hour. It doesn't make any sense. So you want to keep your training objectives fairly short and sweet. Get it done, get it over with, and move on and get out of that training session. But making sure you build up to those training objectives so you've put your horse in the right physical and mental condition to accept that training for that work bout. So when we talk about sport-specific type training, we want to build on small maneuvers. So you start out small and you continue to build into whatever maneuver you're working towards. And you don't over-practice a maneuver. And this is where some of us can really get ourselves into trouble. And I've done it before. I had one mare and she was just a natural stopper. I didn't have to, it certainly wasn't me that brought out her athletic potential. She was just a really natural stopper. And she could back up just beautiful and quick. And I'd just think back and this mare would back. But I overdid it a bit on her initially, when she was a little bit younger, and she got to where, her go-to if she got ticked was backing up, and it was all my fault because I overdid the backup. You see it happen with horses that can spin really well. People just overspin them. So make sure you're not over practicing specific maneuvers. Basically, if a horse can do it really well, that's probably the horse's signal, hey, let's move on to something else and work on something else. Again, you want to make sure that within that week you incorporate some active rest into that week, 1 to 2 days. If you have a real seasoned horse, you may only need to be riding that horse 3 to 4 times a day, actual work. So then turnout would be really appropriate on those off days. Mix up the location of your workouts. Think of some drills. Look on the internet. There's a whole host of different drills and patterns you can work a horse on. Do something totally different. If you've got a Western pleasure horse, and you've got a friend down the road that has some cattle, go out and, play around with the cattle a little bit. Do something different to really freshen that horse up. You may find out that your horse has some sort of hidden talent. And it's okay to have a really short workout. So some days, if you've got a goal in mind or you have something that you've been working with on a horse and, you just haven't gotten there yet, and then one day you get on and you're working and you ask the horse and everything just clicks, give yourself permission to say, wow, this is great. Quit right there. Reward your horse and stop your workout short. Make sure your horse is cooled down appropriately and all that. But reward those big bouts of success. And sometimes that goes a long ways to your horse's long-term attitude. Uh, when we start getting into our more sports-specific training, this is where you really need to watch out for any signs of lameness in the horse, any signs of more kind of chronic fatigue or depression. So if a horse has been doing something pretty easy and all of a sudden it's getting harder and harder to reach that same level of performance, that's a sign that you may need to give this horse a longer period of rest than 1 or 2 days. Listen to how the horse is breathing, listen to how they're recovering. So about that 15 minutes after you quit exercise, the horse's breathing should be coming just about down to normal. If they're still huffing and puffing, 10 to 15 minutes out of quitting your workload, then you need to make sure there's not something else going on with that horse. And then also watch out for, as we're approaching the summer months, really watch out for signs of heat stress. So I live in Michigan now, so heat stress isn't necessarily top of my list of what I'm worried about in the summer, but in Texas, it always was. So when I was working at a training barn, we would start our riding at 4 in the morning and ride till 11, and then start back up at 7 in the evening because it was just too hot between that 11 and 5 time frame to ride a horse. You could really, really hurt them. So keep all of that in mind as you're riding, and document your training journey. Within that training journal, describe your horse, think about how old they are, how much do they weigh, what's their body condition score. When I was working at a cutting horse farm, I would be the one to get all incoming horses and lope them down every day in the big round pen. And part of the reason that we did that, a lot of these horses would come in really heavy and they couldn't work cattle if they were, battling a lot of weight. It would be hard for them to get down without hurting themselves and really get cowy. So I'd spend a lot of my time just loping these horses down, just getting them back to a weight to where they could handle some of the more intense training. So that might be part of describing your horse. Are there any health concerns that you need to watch out for? And then you want to define what is going to be your peak performance. So is it a specific horse show? What classes within that horse show are you looking towards? Are you trying to raise your score in a scored class? So define that peak performance, what that entails. And then write down how your training sessions are going. What are you actually accomplishing in a training session? What do you think is holding back? And then do some brainstorming how you can get to where you're going if you do get stumped, and plan for that next session. And some days, if you've had a really bad riding session and you don't know, you don't have a better plan for the next time you get on the horse, then maybe you need to delay getting back on that horse until you have talked to some experts, or you're working with somebody that can help you through that hard time. And also videotape your ride. Sometimes I'm always a little surprised. Sometimes what I think is like, actually looks pretty good on videotape. And as I really look at what's going on, I get a totally different perspective on how that ride went and where I need to go from there. So the last thing we'll talk about is reconsider long layoffs. So I started off this presentation talking about, living in Michigan, not going to ride my horse in winter. But I will tell you, now that I have a senior horse, that's really coming back to bite me, because my senior horse loses so much muscle mass now over the long winter months. And it's a lot harder now to get him back up to where he needs to be just to do the little bit that I want to do with him. So reconsider really long layoffs. A horse is going to start deconditioning their cardio system in about 2 weeks. Their muscle mass is going to start deconditioning in about 3 to 4 weeks. And then the skeletal system is going to start actually losing bone density in 4 to 6 weeks of deconditioning. So that's a lot of systems to get back up to snuff. So by 12 weeks of a horse not having any kind of exercise program at all, most horses have lost any fitness that was associated with the previous season of exercise. So it doesn't take a whole lot to keep those horses at a decent fitness level during the winter. You can work these horses, just 2 to 3 times a week. And it doesn't have to be the same type of workload that you're going to be doing with them to get them fit up for the riding season in the spring and summer. You can do simple groundwork exercises, turnout, around 3 to 6 hours of turnout is great. Now, I will say this, if you're turning out horses on ice, and especially if they're older, they're not going to run around, so they're probably not going to get a whole lot of exercise. But if you have a decent surface and you've got, some younger horses, when you turn them out, they'll do a great job of giving themselves a nice workout, especially if they're turned out in groups. You can do a lot of conditioning just hand walking and trotting horses, and that might be a good time to practice your showmanship drills or taking your horse through some different obstacles. Or just going out on easy trail rides, even in the snow. Snow adds a lot of intensity and resistance to a ride. So it doesn't take a long time of riding in the snow to get some good work done with your horse. And just ending on some hot weather warning tips as we approach the summer months. Again, you want to try riding more early and late evening. Decrease the duration and the intensity of your ride. As soon as it starts getting into the mid 80s with humidity, you really need to start decreasing the intensity and how long you're riding a horse, because you can really hurt them if they get too hot. Keep your horse hydrated. Make sure your horse has 24/7 access to fresh water at a temperature that's conducive to drinking. And if you're riding your horse over a time frame, you can stop and pause and have drink breaks for that horse. We used to think, oh, you can't let a horse drink if they're working, but actually you can. You can keep your horses hydrated without any ill effects while they're working. Make sure when you do go to cool your horse off that you untack them. One thing I really don't like to see at the horse shows, especially on a hot day, are horses standing around tied up with their tacks still on, especially when they have to stand there, more than 30 minutes at a time. So untack your horse, let them cool off in the shade, sponge them down, hose them down, make sure they have plenty of airflow. That'll go a long ways to keeping them cool during the summer months. So as a quick recap then, You really want to try to develop a thoughtful conditioning program for your horse that's also sports specific. So hopefully today gave you maybe a little bit more idea of how long it's going to take for some of that background training to take place, where you're really concerned with conditioning the cardiovascular respiratory system, the muscular skeletal system, before you get into more sports specific progressive type training to get you where you want to go. Increase the number of riding sessions gradually. So you can't go from being laid up in the barn to, you know, starting out your background program riding 5 to 6 days a week. That's probably just not fair to the horse. So I would definitely start on an every other day and then start increasing those days as you go. Monitor both your horse's physical conditioning, but also their mental response to exercise, because that behavioral response is going to tell you a lot of where they're at physically as well, how they're responding to exercise. And then again, really consider working your horse, you know, 2 to 3 times a week during the winter months versus just laying them off of exercise entirely, just to keep some sort of basic conditioning so you're not having to start all over again in the springtime. But that's especially important with our older horses. So with that, do we have any more questions, Gwen? I can't really see incoming, so
Yep.
I'll let you field anything.
Sure. So we do have some questions that have come in. One just comment the app you were trying to think of earlier that's Couch to 5K.
Thank you. All I could think of was couch potato. That says a lot about me.
Oh, just thought we'd share that one.
Thank you.
And then, so the next question we have in here, and it kind of goes back to when you were talking about the build-up period when exercising a horse. So should there be any change to their diet during the build-up period, and then perhaps later on as their skill level increases, so as they build more stamina and things like that, should you change their diet?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I actually took out all of my body condition and nutrition slides because of time. But basically, you want to keep your horse at a body condition score of 5, which is a moderate condition score. So not too fat, not too thin. And you want to feed accordingly. So if we're talking about an adult horse, our biggest concerns to keep them working is the amount of energy they're taking in. At that point in their lives, they don't necessarily need a lot more protein in their diet because they've finished basically putting on their skeleton as well as their muscle tissues. They've finished all their work as far as growth goes. So protein becomes less of a factor, but energy definitely becomes a huge factor when we're talking about exercise. So energy is basically calories taken in. If we feed horses too much energy, they're going to get fat. If we don't feed them enough, they're going to get too thin. If a horse is too fat when they're exercising, they're really going to have some problems with movement, coordination, but also it's just undue stress on their bones. They're also going to have more trouble cooling down. If horses are too thin, they're going to reach fatigue a lot sooner. So it's keeping up with that energy. So that's a great question. As you progress in your training, and you progress in your intensity of training, your horse is going to be burning more calories. You need to make sure that you're feeding them enough calories to keep them in that body condition score that's going to give them maximum performance. If you want to increase the caloric value of your diet without increasing your grain in your diet, then you may want to go to a higher fat diet. especially for those horses that are doing really intense speed bouts. There's been some research that suggests that feeding fat may help delay the onset of fatigue in horses that are working really intensely. But just from a standpoint of one thing we know is associated with ulcers are high grain diets. So if you have a horse that requires a lot of calories in their diets, you want to try to figure out how to do that without overfeeding grain. So you want to maximize your forage. And you want to feed good quality forage that has a higher caloric density. Okay, so you can maximize your forage. You may also want to feed additional fat in your diet to increase the caloric value without increasing the starch in your feed. So the other thing you really want to be concerned with in your exercising horse, of course, is your electrolyte balance. So make sure that you always have a salt block with your horse and maybe some additional electrolytes in your feeding program. If you're feeding a good commercial grain, then usually those a good feeding program, a good grain source is also going to account for the electrolytes that your horse needs.
So, Chris, there's another question that just came through. And what do you mean by a skinny horse reaching a T? I'm not sure if maybe your audio cut out and maybe.
Oh, right. So, a skinny horse. So a really thin horse. And so when I'm talking a moderate body condition score on a horse, that's a horse that's pretty level over the top. If I feel over their ribs, I can easily feel the ribs, but I can't see them when I look at the horse. They're pretty clean through their neck. They're not carrying excessive fat around their tail or their withers. Okay, that would be a moderate condition score. As soon as you can visually see a horse's ribs, then your horse is starting to get below that body condition score of 5. Now there's a lot of polo ponies, race horses that because of their breed and just how intense they're worked, you'll see faint outlines of their ribs. They may be at a 4.5 or so, but in top fit condition. But a horse stores glycogen and they also use stored fat as part of their energy source when their muscles are contracting, depending on the type of work they're doing. So if they're devoid of all fat sources, stores in their body, they're going to reach fatigue a lot sooner than a horse that has adequate fat stores to pull on when they're working really hard. So I hope that clarified it.
Yeah, I think so. So another question, and this is more of a comment, really, but they're just
Sure.
comment from someone saying that they and their horses do liberty exercises in the winter, and so there's sometimes maybe other ways to keep your horse fit during the winter and get their heart rate up.
Yeah. Absolutely. Anything that gets your horse moving, and sometimes it has to do with the kind of footing and stuff, but liberty work would be something great to try with your horse if you haven't. You just want to make sure you're doing it correctly to where you're not creating any problems. So watching some videos of people that do a really good job with that type of work is important. Know what not to do when you're doing that type of training program. But yeah, that's a great comment. All right.
Thank you. So we're at about 10 minutes after 1, and so I think it's about time to wrap up here today. Do want to mention to everyone that this webinar has been recorded, and we will post it up on our My Horse University website, and of course we've been Facebook Living it, so you can also find the recording there as well. We will also be sharing an evaluation with everyone as well. If you could take a few minutes to fill this out when we send it to you, we'd appreciate it.
All right. Thank you very much. See you next week.